All right, a lot of locals may know that our city's name, Chicago, means wild ramp or stinky onion. But what language is it exactly? Turns out it's Myaamiaataweenki, which until recently hadn't been spoken for over 50 years. Chicago area speakers of Myaamia descent, also in English known as the Myaami, are reviving their native tongue through old dictionaries and a Jesuit missionary prayer book from the late 16 and early 1700s. With us today are George Strack and Brad Kasberg, two people doing the work of reviving their sleeping native tongue. And we're also joined by Paul Daling, who's a journalist who uncovered this story for the Chicago Reader. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you.
Glad to be here.
So Brad and George, I was super excited to have you on the show because hearing language, I think, is just as, if not more important as reading about it. So can we do something different? Can we listen to you both perhaps introduce yourselves in the language?
Iha.
Go ahead.
Tepewa Neolane. Hiya. Wapangia Wainswane. Hi, my name is Brad Kasberg. Nila Myaamiaataweenki. I'm a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma.
Hiya, Tepewa Neolane. Cha-Cha Wainswane. And I am a citizen of Miami tribe of Oklahoma. Cha-Cha is my name. It's sort of a variation of the word George that was
Interesting. And George, you're from Chicago. You also spent some time growing up in Indiana. Is that right?
I spent my summers in Indiana.
Okay.
On a cousin's farm with 9 boys, but I didn't realize that it was Miami land. That I was actually had my walk as there's a saying that goes around. I'm walking on the footprints of my ancestors. I didn't know that at that time.
So when did that become apparent to you? Much later?
Much later, yeah. As a young adult, there was more interest in tribal knowledge and genealogy, I realized that through claims periods that was all Miami reserve land.
There's a rich history there.
Yeah.
Well, Brad, when did you start learning your language?
I started at Miami University, named after our tribe, in southwest Ohio. There's a program there focused on language and cultural revitalization. And through that, really, I was able to do a deep dive into our community's language and history.
Mm. Well, let's bring you in here, Paul. I'm curious what drew you into the story.
It's sort of a roundabout story, but I'll tell it quickly. Researching a book on sort of a political history of murder in Chicago.
Okay.
And so I was starting to look into, stuff before 1812 and restorative justice practices and tribal conceptions of crime, punishment, and what, to repeat myself just now on national radio, because I'm great like that, what became sort of these restorative justice practices that are starting to see light today. And I started getting interested in the language of it and just the amount of culture that's reflected in a single word. Like going back to murder, there's a different Chinese word for murder and murder of a superior officer. And, just in English, the language that's encoded and everything, it sounds weird to say the assassination of Dimebag Darrell from Pantera as opposed to murder, but no one would blink at saying the assassination of John Lennon. So just in language, the amount of information like a different word can use. And so I started looking for someone to sort of walk me through this, and I came across the Myaamia Center. And then I started talking to more linguists and talking for this larger research project. And then I just realized this is a really amazing story on its own.
So why did people stop speaking this language?
Well, I think Brad and George can probably speak to this better, but I think it's not that it was a language that people just lost interest in. There were decades and decades of government policy intent on eradicating these ties, and intent on assimilation. And this isn't, a secret, but it's just sort of, this is not something that, I know we're not using words like died because it's not a dead language.
Yeah.
It's a sleeping language, but this is not a language that people just decided to, lose interest in. This was something that was very intentionally eradicated by decades of government policy.
Yeah. George, why don't you pick up on that? I love the idea that we work around saying that it's simply sleeping, right? And waiting to be awakened. So how does a language go to sleep, so to speak?
Well, let me speak about my family, I guess. I'm fairly certain that my grandfather spoke Myaamiaataweenki
Okay.
because his mother did. But largely the removal policies, we were at a forced removal from Indiana in 1846 to Kansas. And then that land was allotted, and we were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. And that sort of separation from your land, your homeland, is really integral to maintaining culture and language. And that removal and separation and being in communities where your population is in decline, and the amount of just ordinary commerce interacting with the communities. They had to learn English, and when they got to Oklahoma, the community was a very small group of a remnant of the tribe that ended up in Oklahoma. And I think for the same reason, they were there with multiple other tribes that English eventually became the lingua franca for the community itself. And we're thinking that by the 1960s, there were still a few speakers left, and we don't really know that they were really in conversation with each other per se. But but certainly by the early 1900s, the language was in full-blown decline and had gone to sleep.
Yeah, as I mentioned, up until recently, I mean, the language hadn't been spoken in more than 50 years, so that checks out with what you're saying there, George. Brad, where do you even begin to revive a language that can feel lost?
It's complicated.
To say the least.
We're lucky enough that we had outside linguists who had been studying the language originally pretty academically, just as sort of a understanding of grammar, syntax, structure, all of that. But connecting with our community, we realized that it needed that there was room, that it was asleep, that there were people ready to wake it up. And so it was collaboration, as I mentioned earlier, with the university that really turned this into an active practice. And it's to be honest, it's difficult to do because
so?
where do you begin, right? It's language is part of your everyday life, and you're trying to be one or maybe two or three people in a household revitalizing language where there's not necessarily people around you speaking it or anything like it. So really,
it's a lot on your shoulders.
Yeah, it's a lot to really kind of make it a part of your day to day. You have to be really just proactive with it.
Yeah, even that collaboration piece you just mentioned. I mean, do you get together and practice? If so, what's that like?
So, we're lucky. Group texts.
Group texts.
Really
the group
carry
chat.
our water here. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also during the pandemic when we couldn't travel to Oklahoma because that's such an important time for us to sort of all merge together and speak the language together. Over the pandemic, I started hosting a Dungeons and Dragons Myaamia themed campaign with some of my relatives.
Nice.
So that's been a way to really just commit ourselves to holding space and just speaking as much as we can together.
To that end, Paul, I mean, you mentioned in your story in the Chicago Reader how the, quote, switch from academia to activism was tricky. Can you speak more about this and the challenges there?
Yeah, I think one thing I got, because also for the story, I interviewed several non-native linguists working for the Myaamia Center. And also just there's a wide variety of academic literature out there about some of this, articles on JSTOR and stuff. Just the sensitivity of someone who is trained to teach something, learn something in a college setting as just sort of this airy academic thing to study, an artifact for study. And then you're working with people who this is their culture. This is one of the most poetic phrases I came across, and this is actually the name of some institute or something. They can correct me on it, but the breath of life. And I just really and it's just
you're getting nods.
Yeah,
you're correct.
Okay, good. And it's just the idea that language is an academic thing, that you can talk about morphemes and polysynthetic languages and all these other terms that I had to spell check 8 to 10 times to make sure I was getting right. And then just talking to some people like Brad and George and Kathy, who was also in the story, about just what it means. Kathy, who's also in the story but wasn't here today, talked about actually weeping the first time she heard the language spoken. She didn't understand the words. She's only recently started studying it, but just hearing something, knowing that it was something her grandfather had heard as a child, she wept. And so it's just, I found it very interesting, the article, talking to people who were talking about morphemes and technical terms, linguistic terms, and then just the act of weeping just from the act of hearing.
Did either of you, Brad and George, have a similar emotional reaction when all started to sort of come to light?
Yeah, I mean, I can say the first traditional story that I heard was told by George, and I remember not getting it, and I remember it was mostly in English, but just really trying to really learn and expose myself to a whole new world that was opening up for me. So it was unbelievable.
It's overwhelming, it sounds like. I mean, and George, I mean, it's one thing for a person to learn their heritage language, so whether it's Spanish or Arabic, Italian, whatever it is. For most people, that's just an individual choice, right? But for you all, it seems like the stakes are so much higher, because you're not just like learning this for you, but you're learning this for your people, or to keep the future of this language alive. That's such a huge responsibility to take on.
Oh, yeah, and there is a strong emotional component to it. My grandkids all call me Mesha, which is how they refer to me as the grandfather. I have not used either my sister's names or my son's names in years. We use nothing but kinship terminology, which, from my mind, that reinforces that identity and that connection that we have. But again, even in the community when no language was really being spoken in the program, it just commenced, that it was a broad acceptance and support from the whole community that they knew this was important to us as a people and our identity. And to watch the Myaamia Center grow. And I remember a summer program when I was down there with Brad and 3 other guys after a youth program had ended, and I was just standing there in amazement because they'd all learned Myaamia together at the university, and they were all joking and just having a great time together. And I was just like, this is really amazing that you've got
to hear them just speaking it.
And humor, to bring humor back in a language is so important.
It's also this is also a reminder that the crimes committed against indigenous peoples, including forced assimilation, they aren't just of the past, right? These are things that are still very much present today. How do you come to terms with that as you do this work, Brad?
Yeah, it's ever present. You really can't avoid that conversation in any native media, whether it's books, TV shows, anything, because it's front and center for us every day, the remnants of it, but there's still lingering acts of it. Just the idea that Native people can't be in Chicago, right? Just that idea alone is something we constantly have to work against. So it's difficult, and it's just part and parcel with the recognition that being who we are it's a verb. It's not a passive thing.
Very important. Perhaps the most mind-blowing part of reading Paul's story was the fact that you all are not just speaking this language today, you're also adding new vocabulary. What? So, words like cell phone, bicycle. I mean, how do you create new words?
Well, I text people that do it, and then they eventually come up with it.
It's that group chat again.
Yes, it is a critical group chat for the community. I'm not going to lie. We language in the words we use there's an underlying structure to them and a purpose, no matter what language that is, and there's a cultural viewpoint of creating words. I think a funny example in English is walkie-talkie.
I'm already laughing.
Yeah, that's
because
just
how are you going to translate that?
So okay, I don't have the translation for walkie-talkie, but what I mean to say is that the patterns of speech, for example, lemonade. I remember walking through that with folks. We knew the word for tea, mishipakopoe. We knew water was nipe, but we needed something for lemonade, and so we needed a word for lemon, which did not exist in our homelands centuries ago, and so yellow lemon or yellow fruit drink is what we decided on. And
How do you say it?
Unzawa minapoe.
Unzawa minapoe.
Yep.
That's lemonade,
It is.
right? George, tell us more. I mean, and I want to hear more about that humor that you've heard sort of injected in here.
I found it interesting because these were the 4 young men at that point, after a youth camp, had all gone through the program at Miami University, and they had to take they have a heritage program, so they were able to go to school, but they had to attend a requirement class for 6 semesters, and part of it was language. But I think they just hooked up as friends, and I think that was important, is that as young guys do, they joke and tease, and I was just amazed by that kind of thing. But and again, I think Brad brought it up. We have the mechanism. We understand the linguistic formula for creating new words, and it is a group process. It's nothing that anybody does together. But just watching that program evolve from Darrell Baldwin, who started as a grad student, as an adult returning student at the University of Montana, and I remember coming back in summers, and he would sort of teach us on a broken chalkboard board down in Peru, Indiana, just the rudiments of what he was learning, and how, with his connecting with David Costa, who was our primary linguist, and the two of them looking back at all these documents. And first of all, they were in Old French, so they had to have somebody that could translate Old French.
That's right.
Which is this amazing process, the formula they put together to just translate, these at least 30,000 odd words or more, and bring it back into a modern orthography and for people to learn, and then to create programs where you can actually you can go on your phone and listen to an audio file. So if I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, I'll click on the audio file.
There's always an app or something that can help. Paul, I mean, your mind must have been blown doing the research for this.
It absolutely was.
Just seeing this level of collaboration.
Just the mixture of the humor and the emotional resonance. I'm talking to people who are weeping upon hearing a language. And then the translation, you were speaking about the humor a second ago. My favorite translation of one of the newer words was for cell phone, which, if I'm getting this correct, uses the morphemes for little thing one talks into all the time. And I'm like, it is a much better word than whatever cellular refers to.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, it was a really amazing process. And the Myaamia Center has just such amazing resources. They put me in touch with native speakers. They actually got in touch with this through Brad wrote an article for Belt Magazine about his Dungeons and Dragons game, so I reached out to him through that. But just amazing place, amazing resources. One moment I'm talking to David Costa about this archaeological treasure hunt that found the oldest French Myaamiaataweenki dictionary in the Jesuit archives in Canada, and none of them knew what was there. What it was because it was one among a ton of books about Ojibwe. And the next moment I'm talking with people about like hearing it for the first time and the emotional resonance of it. And then I'm getting these amazing. Then I'm hearing about finding new swear words. That's in the article. I don't know if that's clear to say on the air.
That's for another hour.
Yeah. And it was just an amazing story. And just the Myaamia Center was just so great in putting me in touch with people and helping me walk through this very technical very technical story in a way
Yeah.
that it hopefully is still readable.
It's a great story. Brad, what do you want people to know about Chicago Miami and how, or maybe hope that people remember about Native American Chicagoans?
Yeah. So the city of Chicago has one of the largest Native populations of any major urban center. So that alone is something folks should recognize. But in general, I think it's about just understanding our history and our places and our place names, and really understanding that there's a long connection that people have and still maintain with it.
Yeah. George, you talked about, your grandkids, hearing them speak and call you, native names. I mean, why is it important to you that people see this language as something that still exists today? It's not just something of the past.
Well, I think that's it goes across the country. I think Native communities, you see revitalization happening across the country, and I think about, well, why is that happening now, and why is that so important? And I think that it all comes down to belonging. Ultimately, we all need as human beings to belong to something, and to have that common heritage that resides through a language and through places. I mean, when you think about Chicago and the area that surrounds us and the amount of Native names for places where people live, people don't even realize what those names are. Waukegan and Kankakee and Milwaukee, Kenosha. So these are all Native names that people don't even realize the connection to that deep history. And I think it's important for both from a historical perspective, but also as a living community. There's a saying goes, we're not a people of the past, we are people with a past. And to see our community grow, and language is an integral part of that. We are community meetings in Oklahoma, language is always a part of that, and to see people gather and play traditional games, and it does bring something very strong emotional component to all of us.
Very
see that,
special. We've been speaking with journalist Paul Daling and Miami, Illinois speakers Brad Kasberg and George Strack. Thank you all so much.